This video covers a document on Canvas called Quick Guidelines for Handling Outside Sources. This document is going to cover stuff that will be relevant for the rest of the semester. It explains basic techniques that you should use when you are talking about other articles or other sources of information. Please do not rely on this video. I'm going to move through these very quickly, and it is important that you open this document and read the actual PDF as well, or kind of follow along with it as I'm talking about it. I'm going to try to go quick. So the first item on the document covers the intended audience of a college paper. As you can see up at the very top of the page, it says write your college papers as if addressing a larger public audience. And we have two different opening paragraphs here. And it's explained down below, so I won't spend too much time on it. You can read it yourself. But in this first one, the student is essentially writing to somebody who already knows the assignment and has already read the articles that the student has read. That is presuming that the professor is directly the audience for this. And while that is true, and it does make some sense that a student would write this way, you are almost always expected to maintain a sort of fiction that you have a larger public audience in your college papers. You should write as if writing to somebody who is not familiar with what you've read and does not know what the goals of the assignment are. So if we were to look at opening number 2, it does not start off by giving the student's opinion. Instead, it starts off by explaining what happened, in this case, to Cecil the Lion. And then it kind of moves into the articles that it's going to cover. And it's not talking about the articles without actually introducing them. Instead, it's taking the trouble to introduce them to, again, a larger public that needs to be caught up to speed on what you're writing about. You should almost always maintain this fiction that there is a larger public audience. You may occasionally see exceptions in college papers, but not often. Most of the major papers kind of assume that there's this broader public that you're writing to, and that broader public needs to understand what it is you're writing about and what you're trying to accomplish. The next item on the list involves handling names. We are going to be doing this a lot this semester. Let's just cover it really quickly. You should generally try to avoid saying the article says. I mean, it's not totally off limits to say that, but it is way better if there is an author to refer to that author by name. And we do it a specific way. The first time an author comes up, you should use the full name of that author, Brian Clark Howard in this case. Thereafter, we switch to a last name only basis. We say Howard says this and Howard says that. We do not generally say Brian. We try to avoid calling people by their first name only. We use last names as a sign of respect and a sign of professionalism. And you should try to get in this habit whenever you are referring to other writers. Again, you introduce their full name. It's often helpful to clarify what publication they write for, and then you switch to a last name only basis for the remainder of the paper. So the next item we're going to cover is the difference between a summary and a paraphrase. A summary is when you take the whole body of work, like the entire article, all 7 pages of it or whatever, and you boil it down to a paragraph or two. You give like a very broad overview. A paraphrase is where you focus in on one specific idea from that article, and in roughly the same amount of detail and focus, you re-explain that part of the article in your own language. And then the final thing that's on this list, and we'll scroll down a little bit so we can see it here, is quotation. On this next page, I've got an example of a paraphrase, and then I've got a quotation. It's important that you know the difference between these three. Summaries are broad overviews. Paraphrases are step-by-step accounts in which you do use your own original language, but you're covering the content of the article with roughly the same amount of focus. And then a quotation is that moment in which you take somebody's words verbatim, like exactly as they were initially written, and you put quotation marks around them and you insert those in the paper. Now let's talk about basic procedure when you're doing these. It is really common to start with an overall summary. Usually you should do this before you hop into a paraphrase or a quotation. If you're just looking at, kind of the common way of writing about other articles, almost always there should be a sentence or two at least of broad overview where you clarify the author's position and the author's main goals. After you get through that overview, then you can start focusing on more specific targeted parts of the argument, and that's where you end up using paraphrases and quotations a little bit more, and you can kind of point by point go through what the author says in a given part, or you can quote something that the author says. Speaking of quotations, let's cover something that is really important. You do not want to use quotations for basic facts and basic statistics. Instead, you should report basic facts and statistics in your own language. Paraphrase those. Go through and report those in such a way that you're conveying the main point, but don't just use quotations to say something that is a very basic explanation of what happened. Instead, quotations should focus on either explosive statements or statements that you can interpret that allow you to get a perspective on where the author is coming from, or possibly something that shows a particular viewpoint. In short, if you're going to quote, there needs to be some sort of interesting reason you're quoting. If it's just reporting the basic information of what happened, that's usually not what we use quotations for. That's stuff that you should report in your own language. We use quotations when there's something that's particularly explosive or particularly important or insightful. We try not to just use quotations that just explain the basics. Instead, the quotations should accomplish something beyond just explaining what happened. One more additional point about quotations. This is something we're going to be covering in more detail later on in the semester, but whenever you have a quotation, you should go through a couple of steps to make sure that quotation is going to make sense to the reader. So first, you should definitely be clear about who said it, and you should almost always put the speaker tag before the quotation rather than after the quotation. The other thing that is often helpful is to mention a publication that the person writes for. I don't know if it's necessary 100% of the time, but it is helpful. Or if not the publication the person writes for, give some indication of why the person matters. If the person you're quoting is some sort of expert on a given topic, or is, say a local official who's talking about how a given issue has affected a local community, that's a reason to kind of introduce who that person is. And then you should also give kind of a preview for what the quotation says. In this case, we've got a setup for Brian Clark Howard. He states that one of the primary reasons for poaching in Zimbabwe is corruption, and then I get a quotation sort of verifying that. Zimbabwe is often cited for its corruption, which can lead to lax or unequal enforcement. Another additional tidbit while we're on the topic, this little ... that you're seeing here, that, and I can't select it by itself apparently, that means that a little bit of the original quotation has been removed because it didn't matter, or it was awkward, or it didn't fit the context in some way. So when you see that ... what that is saying is that there was additional text that has been taken out of the quotation. It is a very, very small tidbit of information, but we should also be clear about the abbreviation et al. If you have an article that has multiple different authors, more than 3, you are supposed to use that to stand in for the rest of the authors rather than list all of them.